Nicholas Slatten wasn't just any soldier. He was part of an elite private military force known as Blackwater, contracted by the US government during the Iraq War. But in 2007, his name became infamous around the world after a brutal incident in Baghdad's Nisour Square. Slatten and other Blackwater contractors opened fire in a crowded intersection, killing 17 Iraqi civilians. Women, children, and innocent bystanders were caught in the chaos. Witnesses described it as a massacre. And Slatten? He pulled the trigger first, firing the shot that ignited the bloodbath. For years, the case dragged through courts. Slatten was eventually convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison in 2015. It was a major moment, holding a military contractor accountable for war crimes. But the story doesn't end there. In 2020, President Trump granted Slatten a full pardon, along with 3 other Blackwater guards. The move sparked outrage around the globe, especially from the victims' families and human rights groups. They saw it as a betrayal of justice. So while Slatten technically escaped a lifetime behind bars, the stain of Nisour Square will follow him forever. And for many, his case remains a symbol of unchecked power and a broken system. But what you just heard is nothing compared to what happens next. March 11, 2012. A small village in Kandahar province, Afghanistan, was quiet. Families were sleeping, children tucked into bed. Then came the nightmare. That night, U.S. Army Staff Sergeant Robert Bales left his base armed and angry. He stormed into civilian homes one by one and unleashed a massacre. 16 Afghan villagers were killed, 9 of them children. He shot, burned bodies, and terrorized survivors, and then he simply walked back to base covered in blood. The incident stunned the world. Bales wasn't a rookie. He was a decorated soldier, a veteran of multiple deployments. But something had snapped. Maybe it was PTSD, maybe it was rage, maybe it was something darker. His court-martial was one of the most high-profile in U.S. military history. Bales pled guilty to avoid the death penalty and admitted to every murder. The military sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole. Today, he sits in the U.S. disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth. What makes the Bales case especially chilling is the cold-blooded nature of it. These weren't combat deaths. These weren't mistakes. These were deliberate personal executions of innocent civilians, many of whom were asleep in their beds. Bales apologized in court, but for the families who lost everything, no apology could undo what he did. His rampage not only shattered lives, it almost derailed U.S.-Afghan relations at a critical time in the war. You might think the story ends there, but it's only getting started. Because Bales wasn't the only one who crossed the line. If Robert Bales shocked the world, Calvin Gibbs showed just how deep the darkness could go inside the U.S. military. Gibbs was a U.S. Army Staff Sergeant deployed to Afghanistan in 2010. But instead of fighting the enemy, he created one. He led what became known as the Kill Team, a rogue group of soldiers who murdered unarmed Afghan civilians for sport. They staged the killings to look like combat encounters, planting weapons on bodies, taking grisly trophies like fingers and teeth. Gibbs kept them in a Ziploc bag, bragging about his collection. It was evil, plain and simple. What started to unravel the Kill Team wasn't outside investigation, it was an insider. One of the soldiers couldn't take the guilt anymore and spoke up. That's when the truth exploded into public view. In court, Gibbs showed little remorse. He claimed the killings were justified, that the people they shot deserved it. But jurors didn't buy it. In 2011, he was convicted of 3 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison, though eligible for parole after 10 years. The images from this case, bloody photos, videos, even soldiers smiling over corpses, sparked outrage worldwide. It wasn't just about murder, it was about betrayal. The Kill Team had turned the war into a hunting ground, and Gibbs, he was the ringleader, the man who gave the orders, the man who called it fun. This story was so disturbing it inspired documentaries, news specials, and even fictional portrayals. but none of it can capture the horror of what really happened out there in the desert. And just when you think it couldn't get any worse, it does. Johnny Hatley wasn't some young, impulsive recruit. He was a first sergeant in the U.S. Army. 20 years of service, leadership roles, multiple deployments. A man trusted with guiding others, but in 2007, Hatley crossed a line that erased everything. While deployed in Iraq, Hatley and 2 other soldiers detained 4 Iraqi men they suspected of being insurgents. But instead of handing them over to authorities, they took the men to a remote canal, lined them up, and executed them one by one. The bodies were dumped into the water. There was no paperwork, no official report, just silence. For a while, they got away with it, until whispers started surfacing, soldiers' talk, and eventually the army investigated. At his court-martial in 2009, Hatley was found guilty of premeditated murder. His sentence? Life in prison. But with a twist. He was eligible for parole. And in 2020, after serving just 11 years, Hatley walked free. To this day, some still defend him, calling him a hero who made a mistake in the fog of war. But the facts remain. 4 unarmed men were executed in cold blood. No trial, no weapons, just bullets and silence. Hatley's case is one of the most controversial in modern Army history. It raises hard questions about war, justice, and what happens when seasoned leaders choose violence over values. Derek Miller's story starts with a battlefield interrogation in Afghanistan. He was a U.S. Army National Guard sergeant, trained, experienced, and deployed overseas in 2010. But what happened one day on a combat mission would land him in prison for life. During a patrol, Miller detained an Afghan man he suspected of spying for the Taliban. The man's answers didn't satisfy him. So right then and there, Miller shot him in the head. He claimed it was self-defense, that the man tried to grab his weapon. But eyewitnesses, including a fellow soldier, testified that the shooting was unprovoked. The man was unarmed, no threat, just a terrified civilian. Miller was charged and convicted of premeditated murder in 2011. The military sentenced him to life in prison. But unlike others on this list, Miller's case drew a wave of political support. Lawmakers, veterans groups, and conservative media pushed for his release, calling him a war hero unfairly punished for a battlefield decision. And in 2019, their efforts paid off. Miller was paroled after serving 8 years. Today he's free, but the man he killed is not. Jonathan Lee was a young U.S. Army private stationed at Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington State. But in early 2024, his name hit headlines. Not for service, but for murder. Late one night in Tukwila, Washington, a 23-year-old cab driver was found shot to death in his car. Surveillance footage and forensics quickly led authorities to Lee. The motive? Police say it was a robbery gone wrong. During his court-martial, the evidence was overwhelming. Ballistics matched the weapon to Lee. Text messages and phone data placed him at the scene. And Lee didn't deny it. He pleaded guilty. In 2025, he was sentenced to life in prison by a military judge. What makes Lee's case stand out is how fast it all fell apart. One moment, a young man in uniform. The next, a convicted murderer. In April 2025, a soldier at Fort Cavazos, Texas, was sentenced to life in prison for rape, kidnapping, and violent assaults committed against fellow service members. The name remains sealed, but the crimes were brutal and deliberate. This wasn't a single offense, it was a pattern. Victims were lured, assaulted, and silenced, and it all happened within military barracks. At trial, victims testified through tears. The soldier showed no remorse. The judge didn't hesitate. Life, no parole. On November 5, 2009, Army Major Nidal Hassan opened fire inside Fort Hood, Texas. He killed 13 and injured over 30. A military doctor turned terrorist. He claimed the attack was in defense of the Taliban. He was paralyzed after being shot and is now on death row at Fort Leavenworth. A defense contractor who bribed dozens of Navy officers with prostitutes' cash and gifts. Leonard Francis milked the Navy for millions and compromised national security. He fled house arrest but was caught in Venezuela. In 2024, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. In 1968, Cali led the My Lai Massacre, ordering the murder of over 500 Vietnamese civilians. He was convicted in 1971 and sentenced to life, but he served only 3 years under house arrest. He remains a symbol of military injustice. These men once wore the uniform. Now they wear prison blues. Some are behind bars for life. Others walked free too soon. But every case leaves a stain. This is what happens when power goes unchecked, when justice is delayed or denied. If this story shocked you or if you believe in holding power accountable, let us know. Hit that like button, subscribe for more real stories like this, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. Which case hit you the hardest, or do you think justice was served? We read every single comment. Thanks for watching, and remember, truth always deserves a spotlight.